I'm Colton.
And I'm Kalen.
And this is the Future of Thought. What is the state of discourse today?
That's the big question. That's going to be the main and primary focus of this episode of the podcast. But before we get into that, and before we give our opinions and whatever research we have alongside that, we want to clarify why we're doing the podcast and precisely who this podcast is really built for. So we released a trailer leading up to this moment beforehand that delved barely on the surface of why we do the podcast. But the topic for today's episode really hammers home the whole point of why we're doing it to begin with. We want to really expose what the state of discourse is seemingly like today and leave the question and whatever answer may find itself in your palms up for you to discover as we discuss it ourselves. But we also want to go over the pacing, the tone, and our target audience for this podcast so that way you know immediately who this podcast is for.
Now, our goal in creating this is to have a very slow, collected pace when we speak. And that's intentional. We strive to have a conversation with one another and a conversation with others in the future once we begin interviews. And not only a conversation, but an open floor for agreement or even disagreement, arguments and counter-arguments. And we want it to be civil enough that people of any age, of any background, can listen to this and maybe not agree necessarily, but can get something out of what we're saying and won't take any offense or any attack to what we're saying, because we strive to make this open, unscripted, and civil for anyone who listens.
Yeah, so one thing we will strive to do is not take a particular side and carry it throughout the entire argument as though we are representing that one side. Our viewpoints and our opinions differ on a mass spectrum, and we want to make sure that what we present to you is not only a snippet of our own opinion, but also a snippet of fact and research to help substantiate whatever side we may be trying to see or our own side. Our episodes will also be, for the most part, unscripted. We want to treat this discussion like a conversation, like a typical debate, and we want to approach it fairly and organically.
Absolutely. Now, on to our discussion for today. What is the state of discourse? Or at least, what is the perception of discourse in the United States today? And what is the truth value associated with that perception?
So, when we talk about the state of discourse, to clarify, we're talking about how debates are held, how people converse, how information and opinions flow and travel through not only the internet, but from word of mouth and through media sources. And how does that impact people? Is it a good impact or is it a bad impact? And we sum that all up with that very question. What is the state of discourse today? Well, if you ask me, I find the state of discourse to be far worse than how it was in the past. The state of discourse today is really surrounded by presumptions and polarizing media that definitely aims to detract from whatever might be attempted to be gained from debate, and instead turns it into some sort of attack, or instead an argument rather than a debate, which I think is an important distinction.
And this is not a partisan issue. It's not. Pew Research Center conducted a study between April 29th and May 13th of this year. And it fascinates me because in a question as to whether or not individuals found the tone and nature of political debates in the U.S. to be more negative, 85% of responses said this was the case, that our debate is more negative. And the most interesting part is not that everyone agrees, or at least seemingly everyone, but that Democrats and those leaning Democratic and Republicans and those leaning Republican shared that 85% evenly. There was no 90% here, 70% there, or whatever the math comes out to. It was 85% or just about of Republicans and just about 85% of Democrats. And this stat line was seemingly universal through a number of data points. So just to clear the air, it's not that we're debating Republicans and Democrats and the problems that one may hold over the other, but we are debating discourse as a society in the United States of America.
Your point is extremely pivotal and also extremely important because it brings up this important fact that in some regards, Democrats and Republicans think alike. But as you see it portrayed today in many platforms, it doesn't seem like that's the case. Now, research shows in this one regard about how discourse is trending downward. Both sides of the aisle agree. And you can see proof of this not only in the research, but thinking about personal cases at home. Now, personal case scenarios may not be particularly as supported or as great as evidence as institution-backed research. However, if you take a look at all those instances, you're watching public news, for example, debates. I remember watching snippets of the Democratic candidate lineup for the upcoming presidential elections. And what I ended up seeing and hearing was a bunch of ad hominem attacks rather than constructive debate. These candidates were throwing around attacks in an attempt to attract the most out of their audience as though they're some sort of performers. In reality, they are people that are seeking to become leaders. In fact, the leader for our nation, the one behind the flag of the United States of America. And I think especially in a theater such as that of presidential debate, to be acting like some sort of social media celebrity aims to catalyze this polarization and this downward trajectory of discourse in America.
And to expand on that even further, as I think this is an extremely, extremely important point, we're not just talking about day-to-day conversation with your mean uncle who doesn't get along with you very well. Sure, those conversations happen. You may have ad hominem attack, and you may make fun of each other, and that happens, and it's irritating. Absolutely. But as Kaylin was saying, just to emphasize, we are talking about debates for who is going to be the leader of the quote-unquote free world, as it's often stated. Someone with power on a scale that few in this world can understand or can compete with. And we're not saying this, or at least I'm not saying this to be nationalistic. I'm saying this because there's some truth to it. Yet these debates are more of a game at trying to win points than they are a discussion to see who's a better representative for this nation. I remember I was watching, it might have been the first 5 Democratic debates, and the most interesting thing to happen was the discussion as to whether or not Andrew Yang's mic was functioning. Now, I don't know if there's any truth to that, but that was the most interesting point. And we're talking about a national stage of a leader, of a powerful, Western nation, and that's what's interesting. The rest of it was a series of attacks against one another rather than an attempt to build up who you are as a person and ultimately what your platform is and how you can better society.
Another thing that I want to segue on the topic of how just overall the culture of debate has degenerated to this nonsense of name calling, of calling out, so to say, is media coverage. Something I've previously mentioned already in these first 10 or so minutes of the podcast. But to expand, there are a lot of things about media in today's society that help catalyze this negative connotation that debate and discourse has today with politics and really anything revolving around stigma. A point of interest when it comes to media and how it handles conveying information to the public is the idea of polarization, something I also mentioned previously when talking about coverage on presidential debates and discourse today. To delve further into this point, something to discuss is how media acts as a catalyst for polarization in America today. Do you have anything to say about that, Colin?
I think, and feel free again to disagree with me, I think the general public actually guides the news today, news coverage. For example, I think that the news as a corporation aims to make money, right? Now, in that quest for money, the news is going to display whatever it is the general public strives to see. Now, of course, that's more likely to be something negative or sad or to make you angry because that gets more hits, period, across the spectrum. But it's going to be, let's say, Fox News or CNN supporting something using a different verbiage than the other, saying something in a way that puts someone at fault who you disagree with because of your political identity, as it were. And I think ultimately that is the proximate cause for news and what it displays. So it's not that the news leads the general public, but that the general public leads the news, I think.
An interesting point. Of course, I disagree. You see, I do think you have an interesting point, though, because without a public driving a media source, there would really be nothing to report on. And so I guess it would make sense in my head to see these two aspects playing hand in hand. A polarized public playing into a polarized media outlet to further perpetuate this cyclical pattern of growing farther and farther apart in biases and viewpoints in America. When I look at it, I see a media source that covers only what you want to see, right? Media stations and media companies today really are categorized by their political standing, where they stand on whatever spectrum you would like to use for your politics. You usually choose the media source that best feeds your confirmation bias, which best feeds the viewpoint you want to hear. And I guess your point makes sense because when you look at it that way, if they didn't want to hear it, the media wouldn't have any place to show it. And so an interesting part of discourse today is the fact that this is a self-perpetuating issue and something that we should definitely look at as a society. If we continue listening to only what we want to hear, we become extremely susceptible to these polarizing outlets. And instead of thinking that we're solving an issue, we're instead helping catalyze it by being limited in our viewpoint and mindset. And so, to that regard, I think you have an extremely good point and maybe have changed my mind a little bit. So,
to even expand on that, because it seems like we both find at least some value in understanding different viewpoints. This leads us to a problem I want to touch on we have today. And this is common, particularly in social media, in directed ads, or in a YouTube algorithm. Whatever it is that you searched up, right? Let's say you wanted to learn more, even if you had good intentions, about an alt-right extremist, let's say. If you do one search, try this at home when you're done listening. Of course, listen to the rest of the podcast, but try this after. Go to YouTube and search up a video of something. It doesn't matter what. If you want this to work really well, search up 2 of them. And then go back to your home recommended feed, refresh it, and see what videos come up next. I can almost guarantee that they will not only have been influenced and changed, but will be very similar, if not more extreme than whatever it is you just looked up. Now, this isn't just speculation. This is clearly represented through a number of people who have done this. And it happens, and you can understand why it happens, because an algorithm that makes someone interested, that keeps you on the website, makes a website more money, right? That's just the fact of the matter. So please, after this, go try this out on your own. See what you can learn about the algorithm and try to understand that confirmation bias is no longer a mental faculty that it seems like humans really enjoy entertaining, but it is now a digitized, monetized faculty that capitalistic corporations really enjoy taking advantage of. And I realized that was something of an aside, but I thought it was a really crucial point in understanding one facet of how media polarizes today.
Yeah, and bonus points if you look up something that's extremely far right or far left. Be careful what you search, because in today's world of technology and advancements in data collection, the idea of discourse in its current state in our society declining is really only hindered by these mega corporations taking advantage of mega data sets and using them against the everyday user to help, as Colton stated, their confirmation bias.
Before we continue, we'd like to make a quick announcement. We run this podcast ad-free. Of course, with the trial version of Spotify, for example, some ads are simply out of our control. However, we will never run third-party ads during the Future of Thought podcast. This podcast acts to provide accessible, unhindered discourse for all who listen. Because of this, we rely on you, the listener, to support this podcast. Support us by visiting our Patreon at patreon.com/The Future of Thought and selecting the tier of your choice. Regardless of how much or how little you choose to donate, you are a greatly appreciated listener. Now let's get back to the podcast.
So, another thing we'd like to talk about today is political identity. And we want to talk about political identity because, as research I've done shows, it plays a huge role in polarization. And as we made the connection earlier, polarization plays a huge role in deciding the state of discourse.
Political identity, or at least as we're calling it, fascinates me. Today, the terms liberal or conservative or whatever you may decide have ever-changing and somewhat new definitions. For example, liberal. If you look at classical liberalism, arguably a foundation in our country's history, it is a word that entails individual sovereignty, limited government, and so forth. And I'm not saying whether or not I agree or have a preference, but the terms have changed. Political identities seem to be today taken less as descriptions of how you understand economics and politics and so forth, but rather are used as insults or derogatory emotional remarks just to jab at someone else for the mere fact that they're different than you. And because you're different, well, that's unacceptable, as it may be said.
Political identity is something in today's society that's definitely invoked a sense of tribalism in many people. And it is an extremely important pivotal topic in today's society, as it is often confused, in my opinion, with another facet of human life entirely, personal identity. Colin, you mentioned earlier that the economics and the policy are really what go into a political identity. But today, you see other things being dragged into the mix. You see gender, race, sex be categorized under this blanket term of political identity when things such as gender, sex, and race are something that are more concerned with the individual. Now, in my understanding, it is extremely important to categorize people correctly, to be able to know target demographics, to be able to know who is influenced by what. But I think today we have redefined political identity in a bad way, and in fact have confused it for many things that it is not. And this simply helps the state of discourse become more polarized. Because now you have these media algorithms. You have things on Facebook, on YouTube. You have public speakers, presidential candidates, senators, congressmen speaking out to you on a personal level, because now they're targeting not only your political identity, but your personal one too, because we have confused the two for the same thing. And so when you talk about classical liberalism, it is a point that, in my opinion, pays homage to a past where debate was at least better kept. Because in those times, we could differentiate our personal lives from that of taxes, state laws. And many times we find those things intertwined, such as the freedom of speech, to practice, or rather, to have a religion to follow, to have all these things that are personal to you. But in the game of politics, it has become extremely convoluted and only invokes primal emotions rather than constructive thought towards solutions, in my opinion.
I think all of that is true. And it is only accentuated by today's state of bipartisanship. Not only are we conflating the ideals of one's political identity and one's personal intrinsic identity, but we are combining that with the aforementioned tribalism or sectarianism of a two-party system. We are now at a point where it's not only that I disagree with you and I may hate you because your politics are different than me, but now it's that I have to hate you as a person. I have to disagree with you at your core because of any number of differences that define you and everyone else, supposedly, in your group. For example, I find it fascinating how you can predict almost everything a person believes politically or personally, as they seem to be conflated, by knowing one facet of their life. If you know someone who supports gun rights to a large extent, chances are they are also pro-life, I suspect, have a higher chance of supporting objective Christian values, and the list goes on. And I'm not here to say any of those are bad or the wrong ideals. I may even support some of them. But what I'm saying is we now can be predicted on such a shallow level. And with only two options, with only two parties, as it were, it is just a continual butting of heads that, at least in my and in Kalen's opinion, appear to be damaging each other more and more as our political identities combine with our personal identities.
Bipartisanship is really something that would be aided by, in my opinion, having intermediary parties, having places for people that don't necessarily align all the way with the Democratic Party or don't necessarily align all the way with the Republican Party to feed into. People that see eye to eye on both left and right policy and would like a middleman to represent them. I think people would better be able to identify their political standings if not only we got rid of bipartisanship, but also our media did a better job of representing different viewpoints across multiple platforms instead of two sides of what is, in all honesty, a much bigger story and a much deeper story in America.
I think that's better. I do. Clearly, you can see my distaste for a two-party system. If that wasn't clear, I apologize. However, I do think we could do better than a multiple-party system. And you may be wondering, well, if you don't want more parties and two's about as low as it gets to have disagreement, what could I possibly stand for? I believe pretty strongly that a no-party system, a system in which we merely elect candidates based on their cumulative set of ideals for how to better the nation economically, societally, whatever it may be. We vote on the ideals. And if we do this, we no longer are confined to whatever group identities we have attained. We become individuals. Every human is understood to vote on a set of ideals that are at their core. And if certain sets of ideals over a domain, or rather multiple domains in politics, if certain sets of those ideals become favored, well, then that politician gets elected. Not because their party has the most supporters, not because they were really good at gerrymandering, but because the American public decided these were the values they wanted to uphold today. But feel free to disagree with me on that, Kalen, if you want to expand on the multi-party ideal.
So, I do think your no-party idea actually sounds very attractive because it gives more power and it gives more voice to people. Whereas an any-party system, in some way or another, could favor incumbents. It could favor people that donate more, people that contribute more to the party rather than the people. Obviously, you can see that today. It's a huge curse on our politics, and it really stands to detract from the state of discourse, because having parties confines people to a specific way of thinking, and in some ways invokes a group mentality, especially in the two-party system we have today, in which that is a much more overblown issue. However, a no-party system really leads to, in my opinion, such an individualistic state that it becomes more divisive rather than cohesive. With at least some parties of which you could reflect many of your political ideologies, you would have representation and a sense of cohesion that, although may set you apart from different people and may set you apart from people of other parties, at least aids itself in the sense that you can now see many similarities cross-party, and that you're no longer thinking that you're against a common foe or a common enemy, but instead working in conjunction with many other people that, although may have different viewpoints in some areas of politics or policy, you may actually work together, because now in the two-party system we have today, to further explain my point, many Democrats and many Republicans in a 2016 Pew Research article often thought ill of the other party. They usually thought that the other party thought against them. Overwhelming majority of right, or I should say conservative party members or Republican Party members believe that upwards of 70% of Democrats were some form of negative adjective. Now, what that negative adjective was, I'm unsure, but an equal number, if not higher, percentage of Democrats also believe the same of Republicans. And I think in a multi-party system, these coinciding cleavages would be less severe, less tragic, because in a multi-party system, there's no longer red or blue, there's no longer black or white. You have all of these various forms of gray of which you can better situate yourself and understand the platform of others. Of course, this plays into media doing a better job of covering and making sure that the public knows who represents what. And this also plays on algorithms and confirmation bias, but most importantly also plays on how these candidates in these parties portray themselves and debate constructively rather than ad hominem. So, in my opinion, no parties is too divisive to really be a practical institution, or I should say a practical replacement of bipartisanship. But I guess that's where we would disagree there.
I will say this. I think I need to draw a line between what's practical today and what is ideal. Now, not to be idealist to the point of unreachability, but I would claim that a system without parties simply takes your ideals and maybe the ideals of others for a multiple party system and just goes one step further. It grays just a little bit more. It breaks up the chains of sectarianism completely. Is it realistic? Well, maybe not. Sure. At least not today. And that could be for a number of reasons, the largest of which I suspect is simply social norm or taboo. It would make people uncomfortable. People don't like change. I'm well aware of that. And admittedly, the United States is extra good, depending on your perspective, at tradition or being uncomfortable with changing. And that's all right. But I think ultimately, whether we can agree on this point or not is fine. I think ultimately, if we can work towards removing ourselves from group ideals, we act to empower ourselves and to empower posterity to be individuals that everyone claims the United States promotes. So I hope that distinction of what's practical today and what I think is really valuable and at the core of not having this system of parties makes sense.
So, our final opinions on the state of discourse today. Well, I guess we should give those, huh? To wrap it all up in a nice little package. If you were to ask me, Colton, what my final opinion on the state of discourse today would be, I would say it's declining. And to clarify, that is to say, we as a society here in America are being forced into a position through media, through algorithms, and through how these figures that we are supposed to view as leaders are creating an example for us in becoming driven by emotion. In every way that we interface with news, with media, and with information from point A to point B, there are algorithms, and there are all sorts of barriers in our way that are preventing us from really looking at things constructively and critically. And so I think it would be unwise of me to place any blame on the people as much as on our current leaders and big corporations, as they continue perpetuate things that not only make them money, as today we live in a very strong attention-driven economy, but also what keeps, in the case of politics, incumbents in office, because they want to keep their job, probably. So, my opinion is that the state of discourse needs fixing. And that starts with people knowing. That starts with us learning that there are algorithms out there on Google, on YouTube, on Amazon that take information on what you click, on what you like doing, on pages you've searched, and on things you find interest in, and uses that against you. Knowing that debate can be carried out in better ways, in more constructive ways, that don't rely on emotion and targeting people to create a sense of victory, but instead rely on constructive criticism and refutation that instead lends itself towards being closer to a solution rather than devolving into name-calling.
I think it would be a waste of everyone's time for me to say the exact same thing for the next 3 minutes.
Yeah.
I agree with everything that was just said in its entirety.
Well, do you have any final remarks for the end of this episode then?
I would like to spread something with you all, the audience. The next time you engage with public discourse, whether that be discussion of your own or watching a debate, let alone the presidential elections, pay close attention to the substance of every argument you hear. Not the fluff, not necessarily how it's said, but listen and look for the whys of every statement. Because if you can understand why someone is saying something, you become a much more knowledgeable individual. And frankly, I think I can speak for Kaylin and I, we will certainly be sure to do the same. We strive to never stop learning, as knowledge is the only way to truly escape the trenches of ignorance.